Hello, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. My guest today is Dr. Tanisha C. Ford, a full professor of history at the CUNY Graduate Center, named one of Root's 100 most influential African Americans, an award-winning writer, and she is here to discuss her latest book, Our Secret Society, Mollie Moon, and the glamour, money, and power behind the civil rights movement. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Ford, I kept saying, what? You're a full professor at CUNY Grad? How did you do that? So quickly, so easily. We're going to talk about the book, but let's talk about your career, your profession as a full professor in the history department here.
I've long had an interest in history since I was a little black girl in the Midwest. I started by looking at my parents who came of age in the 1960s, and I was fascinated with the social movements of that era. I went to school to study English literature, thinking I would be a high school English teacher, but picked up a second major in African American studies, and that's when I really started to imagine the possibility of teaching on the collegiate level. I pursued a master's in African American studies from the University of Wisconsin, and then also a PhD in 20th century U.S. history from Indiana University Bloomington, and was one of the people who was able to get a tenure track job and have moved myself along the ranks of the academy. In 2019, I became a full professor. And it's a beautiful journey, but it's one that I'm also helping other black women achieve because far too few of us have achieved that rank of full professor.
And generally when it happens, and we have so many complicated stories of African American women in those positions, so your being there is a tremendous asset. You were teaching last night. This is part of our CUNY family. Forgive us for a second while we talk about that. And you were teaching a class here at the Grad Center on race and capitalism. Tell us a little bit about that course.
Well, I love teaching this course because it allows students to connect social and economic issues of the day with historical events through the lens of race. So we think about issues like racial capitalism. What does it mean that the United States was built upon a slave economy and that exploitation of African Americans is deeply ingrained in every system that has been produced in this economy. So our students grapple with these things, reading works by black women's historians who are writing about like the value of the enslaved bodies, both in life and in death. We've read things about race and philanthropy in this country. So students get a wide array of source material to draw from as we have these very complex conversations.
Right. And of course your book on Mollie Moon is about philanthropy and is about funding the civil rights movement, millions of dollars that nobody ever paid any attention to, including, I've heard you say, including you as a historian. So tell us how you got to her.
It's true. I hadn't even thought about the money. You know, I was looking for someone else. I was a dissertator at the time, so this was around 2010. And I was looking for another woman who was a black model at the time. And I was fascinated with black models because our beauty wasn't celebrated in that way. So when I could find black women who were able to break into the mainstream modeling world, I thought, wow, these women are worth study. So I was finding this other woman and stumbled upon the name Mollie Moon in the archive because Doris Chambers, the woman I was looking for, was actually a contestant in one of Mollie Moon's beauty pageants. And I thought, Mollie Moon, what a fabulous name. I just loved saying it, Mollie Moon. And so I decided I would just continue to collect articles written about her from the 1950s and 1960s, and before I knew it, I had amassed an archive of hundreds of newspaper clippings. And I realized that most of these events that she was hosting were fundraisers. And I thought, wow, fundraisers for the civil rights movement. I've never really thought about that. And if I'm a historian of the civil rights movement and I've never really thought about these questions, think about how many other Americans have never thought about how this movement was funded and by whom. And so it really sent me on a journey to find the money behind the movement.
And the money behind the movement turned out to be Mollie Moon and many other black women who raised money through lunches and events and whatever, and to give to students and voter registration and all of the things that were necessary during the civil rights movement.
And that was the beautiful part of this story, Carol, like to see how Black women rallied around the community to raise funds. These were women who were like Mollie Moon. They were power brokers in their own communities. They had amassed networks of political insiders, media personalities, celebrities of stage and screen, everyday Black doctors and lawyers who would give to their causes and attend their events. So if you can imagine women like this in major cities across the United States who had joined forces under the auspices of the National Urban League Guild, which Mollie Moon founded in the early 1940s. And by the time we get to the 1960s, I mean, they are a major power force in their local communities and doing amazing work for the National Urban League to raise money for the movement. So I just love the fact that Black women weren't on the sidelines. They were at the center of the conversations about fundraising and really shaping a lot of the strategies around fundraising for the movement.
So Mollie Moon, I told you before, I knew Mollie Moon, not well, so your book has just been fabulous. I love every page, every word of it, because I met Mollie Moon in the 1970s when she was a matron. She had been doing this for many years, but then I read in your book that in early 1930s, Mollie Moon is in Russia, and then after that in Berlin, and made that trip from Hattiesburg, Mississippi to Russia to Berlin, and then back to Harlem. So tell us a little bit about her story.
First, let me just say, when you told me that you met her, the historian in me was like, what? This is amazing. If only I had met you a year or two ago. I would love to interview you for the book. Mollie Moon was a really fascinating figure, and like so many of the figures in our communities that we meet as elders, we don't realize the life that they lived before we knew them, and Mollie Moon was one of those figures who had lived such a long and rich and fulfilling life early on, and so it was a pleasure to spend time with her personal correspondence to piece together her early life, to use the letters of other people in her social circle to piece together this world. So yeah, she was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, grew up in Cleveland, Ohio for a time before moving back to Mississippi and attending high school at Rusk College, the secondary school at Rusk College. She received a pharmacy degree from Meharry Medical College in the late 1920s, and in the early 30s moved to Harlem, where she joined members of the Harlem Renaissance community. People would think about like Langston Hughes,
Dorothy West,
Hurston, Dorothy West, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay. I mean, she was really a mover and shaker in this scene, more on the social end for her. She's always been a very social person. But when Louise Thompson, another one of their good friends, is called on at the behest of the Communist Party USA to put together a cast for a racial propaganda film that will be shot in Moscow in 1932, Mollie Moon joins this cast.
Just putting those words together was, reading that was just extraordinary. How do you do that? So at any rate, they are there, but then they get stranded, right?
Yes, the film is never made. They get caught up in geopolitical struggles between the nascent USSR and the United States, and the film is never made. And it really divides the group, where certain of the groups, including Mollie's future husband, Henry Lee Moon, he decides that, like, no, we've had it, we're going back to the United States, and other people decide to stay on in Moscow. Other people move to other parts of Europe. Mollie's one of those people who decides to resettle in Berlin. She takes the money that they're given by the film company and relocates to Berlin. And she's moving there in, 1932, 33, like around the time.
I love that little subtext. It may have had something to do with a dalliance with a German baron or something like that.
But
at any rate,
part of the rumor.
She winds up in Berlin, and for her time there, becomes fluent in German.
She does. She enrolls in classes there. So she's a student by day. She's working in a lesbian cabaret by night as a hostess, So she's really getting to experience a vast, array of life in Berlin, But as a student, she takes extensive German language courses. She ends up also working very closely with U.S. students who are in Berlin doing a study abroad through Columbia University's Teachers College. She actually uses her language skills to help them as they travel throughout Germany to study the German educational system. And she returns to the United States thinking that she's going to become a biology teacher, that she's going to receive advanced training to become a biology teacher.
Yeah, it's so complex because she's there as the beginning of the bad things happening in Germany, the Nazism and all of that, the precursor. So
Most certainly. So it was interesting to read from her own experience and perspective what it was like to witness the persecution of people, but also the burning of books and, just the death of radical ideas, or what the, Nazi state saw as radical ideas. And even people that she knew, she could, like James Weldon Johnson, she could see their works being burned, in a major square in Berlin. And this radically, shaped Mollie's perspective on politics and on the global struggle for freedom.
So she comes back to New York, and again, with all of her, Langston Hughes buddies and whatever, becomes politically active in Harlem, and begins to work for the Urban League. But the whole guild, the sort of adjunct to it, which really became the driving force of it, was because she was excluded from the executive committee of the Urban League, and she creates the guild.
Well, just to backtrack just slightly, so she comes back to the United States and she's able to help the Harlem Community Arts Center, their fundraising initiatives, and this becomes one of her major fundraising initiatives. And it's through that work that she partners with Lester Granger, who then becomes the head of the National Urban League, and he asks her to found the guild. So this happens in 1940, where they work together to begin planning these ideas, and then they eventually launch the guild just as we're moving into World War II. And during Lester Granger's reign as the head of the National Urban League, Mollie was definitely instrumental in the organization and building the guild and shaping a lot of the Urban League's community outreach and programming. But once Lester Granger is forced to retire in 1961, Whitney Young then becomes head of the Urban League, and it's Whitney Young who then has a new vision for the Urban League, and in that vision, people who were instrumental in the Granger era are now pushed to the margins, and so that means that Mollie is displaced from her position on the board. She becomes more of a figurehead, someone who has institutional history for sure, but is not necessarily central to Whitney Young's militant professionalism vision for the Urban League as the civil rights movement intensifies in the early 1960s.
Yes, but this is when Mollie Moon's philanthropy and her skill at networking and like the Beaux-Arts Ball and all of these events. I love the luncheon you described where Martin Luther King Jr. is obligated to come and speak to the wealthy donors, and the complexity of that, of understanding what leaders in the civil rights movement had to do in order to get the money to do the work that they needed to do. So talk about a little bit about that.
Yeah, the leaders of the civil rights movement were really facing a catch-22 situation, where on the one hand, the movement needed money because the needs in the African American community were so great. The programming of organizations like the SCLC, which King was the head of, also the NAACP, Roy Wilkins headed up, and the National Urban League, which at this point is headed by Whitney Young, and other organizations needed money to expand their programming. But where could that money come from? Where should it come from? So part of this was a grassroots initiative that people, like Bayard Rustin, for example, Mollie Moon, Daisy Bates, and others were a part of really mobilizing the grassroots and finding funds among working class African Americans, middle class African Americans. But then there's this other dynamic where people like King and Young and others, Dorothy Height, are being invited into rooms with wealthy white donors, and they have to choose whether or not they will take money from the Field Foundation, the Taconic Foundation. And many of them choose to take this money to fund major things like the voter registration drives that were necessary in the early 1960s, and also things like the March on Washington. Mm-hmm. So there's this mix of wealthy white philanthropists who are in the conversation, celebrities like Harry Belafonte, everyday African Americans. And so it's like, what do we do here? How do we receive the funds that we need to fund social justice? But on the other hand, how do we create the kind of legislative change that would make it so it's not necessary for movement organizations to have to carry the brunt of, supporting the Black community in terms of basic human and civil rights?
So the whole fundraising philanthropy world, having been in the nonprofit world, leading a couple of organizations and having to do that, I don't want to say it's begging, but, asking, and presenting and proving yourself. I mean, that must have been something for her. But Mollie Moon just had a way of gathering stars around her, and I think that's the whole idea. She did it by glamour.
She most certainly was a glamorous woman. By all accounts, she was vivacious, she was charismatic, she was also brilliant. She was, by the time she comes back to the United States, her dreams of becoming a high school biology teacher are dashed.
What biology lost,
right?
the civil rights movement gained.
Exactly, and so she actually finds work as a social worker. And this is another industry where African Americans felt like they could make a deep impact for social change and racial equality. So she has these skills of a social worker, someone who's able to come into a home or a community and assess needs and determine how to best provide resources for that community. So she's able to bring that element of her expertise to the movement and pair that with her love of a good party, and so she was able to really pull together people who were invested in the movement, invested in the cause of racial and economic justice, and do so by having a good time. If you could get potential donors liquored up, if you could get them having a good time, it makes the ask a lot easier, and so she knew how to make that ask and get the money and create memorable events that people wanted to return to every year.
Yeah, I showed you the picture that I am almost certain was at a Mollie Moon event, one of the Beaux-Arts balls, with me standing with James Van Der Zee and Romare Bearden. It's that kind of, they were being honored. So, we'll have to do the research. We'll
Yes.
nail down the history of the photograph, but it was such a Mollie Moon kind of thing. She would bring, these legendary, iconic people, friends of hers, to a gathering. And as you say, it wasn't just the wealthy who attended those events. There were people who saved up all year long so that they could buy a ticket, to a Mollie Moon event.
Most certainly. There's a beautiful image in Jet magazine of a domestic worker dancing with a member of the Rockefeller family. And the journalist emphasized that this is the place where uptown and downtown meet at a Mollie Moon event, and that was the beauty of it. And early on in the history of the Beaux-Arts Ball, it was a costumed affair. So people came in their costumes, and the costumes leveled the class playing field, so that a domestic worker could dance alongside a titan of industry. And that was Mollie Moon's vision for philanthropy, that it was definitely a horizontal approach. She wanted to dismantle this notion of, a class hierarchy, which is part of what she was influenced by during her time in Moscow, for sure. And so I love that. I joked about, her getting people liquored up, but just to say that, it wasn't necessarily about the booze, but it was just about fun. And she loved a good vintage champagne, and people could most certainly dance and enjoy at her events.
Yeah, but she was doing, in a sense, the Harlem Renaissance salons on a very large scale, with hundreds of people, as opposed to, that tiny inside group. So you had access to her papers. In the end, or towards the end, how did she feel about everything that she had done? Did she understand the contribution that she had made? Was she bitter at all about not getting the recognition then?
I believe she definitely understood the contribution that she had made. In fact, near the end of her life in 1989, the National Urban League establishes the Mollie Moon Volunteer Service Award, and Mollie Moon is still alive to give this first award to Helen Hardin, a woman who had been in the trenches with her doing work with the Guild since the 1940s. And when Mollie gets up to give the award to Helen, she says, over the decades, the Guild has given the Urban League millions of dollars with no strings attached. And I think for her, that was part of her legacy, this idea that, when we give our money, we have to give it without all these mandates about how and where the money could be spent. Unlike some of the other philanthropic and corporate foundations that the Urban League was receiving funds from that had very specific requirements about where the money needed to go, what it could be spent on, what it couldn't be spent on, Mollie Moon said, we gave our money without strings attached. And again, for me, that's part of that very grassroots notion of Black philanthropy, of mutual aid. And I think that was a huge part of her legacy. I don't have a sense that she was bitter. I think that she also really respected the fact that that it was Black women who demanded that she be recognized for the work that she had devoted her life to. Work that, I might add, was not paid work. All the fundraising and volunteerism she did for the Urban League over the course of 50 years was out of her own commitment to the movement, her commitment to the African American community.
50 years of dedication. And is there a dollar figure that's been placed on the amount of money that she raised during that time?
In today's figures, it was around maybe $6 million. Now, to some people, that might not seem a lot, but you have to think about the fact that she's raising this money in Jim Crow America, right? When we are racially segregated legally for many of those years when she's doing fundraising, but even after Brown v. Board, I mean, integration was slow. And so Mollie Moon was able to raise a lot of this money by mobilizing the Black community. And so it's important to note that many of the dollars that she raised came from everyday African Americans who had a deep commitment to giving, a lot of which comes out of our, community traditions of susu or of tithing our 10% to the church, so it's definitely from a global South perspective on giving. And Mollie Moon, who herself was not born into wealth, had a deep commitment to the everyday sense of, mutual aid and also volunteering one's time and energy to the movement.
Well, she may have set the bar, because what it reminded me of is Mackenzie Scott's giving now, the ex-wife of the Bezos Amazon money. She has billions of dollars, and she's been trying her best to give it away. And as she did it in the beginning, no, do not fill out a 50-page form. Here's the money. Take the money and do your good work. So philanthropy, you're teaching capitalism and philanthropy and all of that now. Is that, do we need to ask fewer questions and have fewer strings attached to money?
I do think so. I do think that we need to have fewer strings attached. I mean, so often the money does not get to the communities that need it most. And oftentimes studies have shown, in fact, Ms. Foundation did a study that showed that Black women-helmed nonprofits don't receive nearly as much money as organizations helmed by white people of any gender. So still there are disparities in terms of where the money is going. So if you think about that in conversation with the fact that there are now so many strings attached to how that money can be used, it means that a lot of it isn't getting to the communities that need it most. And Mollie Moon, I think, was a figure who definitely understood that. So I do think that there's a way we can look at Mackenzie Scott's model of giving and say that she is borrowing from tried and true African American traditions of giving that say, we understand what our communities need. And, so if you're going to give us money, you need to let us do the work that we know needs to be done in our own communities.
That is true. I'm sure you know that the Ms. Foundation now has a $100 million goal to raise, during this year. They already have, they're almost there. Someone bequeathed $50 million to them for their work with Black girls and Black women. So, tremendous. They alone probably have, and it's a Black run. A Black woman is Teresa Younger is at the head of the Ms. Foundation. So let's go back a little bit to talk about the burning of the books and the academia and your career. I mean, we're not exactly burning books yet in squares, but we are hiding them in classrooms across the country. Talk to us about your feelings about your books yet, the subject of banning.
Someone did send me the study, maybe it was done by The Atlantic, where my book was on a list of books for something. I'm not quite sure if they've been banned, but first of all, the political dishonesty around topics like critical race theory is really infuriating. And just the idea that we would hide Black intellectual production because it is a challenge to white supremacy, for me, is another thing that I find incensing. So my job as a historian is to continue to produce the work that allow us to ask the difficult questions about race and class and economic disparities in this country. It's also the work of centering women like Mollie Moon, who were agents for change in this country, a history that people might not want young Black children, but any children, children to understand about the country in which they are being raised. I think that there is a way that we can teach this material and present it with a cultural and social sensitivity, but also not lie about the history of race and racism in this country.
Well, absolutely. You know, and the Mollie Moon book is going to be a tremendous hit. It already is, but I think that I recommend it because there's so much about that one woman's life that is so incredible. You know, as I was reading it, I was saying, is this the Mollie Moon that I knew? What? You know, Russia, Berlin, 3 marriages, a very, very inventive, creative. She invented herself in a way, you know, as we said, a complete invention. And you have rescued her from oblivion, and for that we thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for being with us today. Our thanks to Dr. Tanisha C. Ford, history professor at CUNY's Graduate Center, award-winning writer and author of Our Secret Society, Mollie Moon, and the glamour, the money, and the power behind the civil rights movement. Thank you all for being our guest today, and all of you for watching with us. We will see you the next time. The show is Black America. I'm Carol Jenkins.